You published this book in June of last year.
June 2017.
So you've had 9 months of this at least, the sort of the bandwagon rolling. And before that, of course, the blog as well. And I just wonder, do you feel as though you're having an impact? Are you changing anything?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask because obviously I'm in the eye of the storm here. So obviously from my perspective, people come to me all the time and they say, oh, my mind has been changed, or the book gave me the support I needed to go and have a conversation that was hard, but tough, but you know, it had some impact. So I'm obviously going to say yeah.
So it's been rather uplifting as a process.
It's been, I think, sort of a constant surprise to me to see how people are embracing it. I saw somebody on social media the other day saying, I shout about this book as if I wrote it. That's what they were saying, telling other people about it, going off and spreading the gospel, which is always a bit shocking to me. But yeah, it's been overwhelming. It's been exciting. But I think crucially, what I hear from my readers again and again and again is what they are feeling is backed up by this book, supported by the book. To be able to challenge injustice where they see it.
Well, we should talk a little bit about the content and what the basic arguments are and how it came about, first of all. So the blog was February 2014 that started all this, and it's a pretty angry, fiery, polemic piece of writing. Had something happened to provoke you?
I don't know I find it to be more sorrowful rather than angry. You know, I think about the emotions that I was feeling at the time, and it was really just a bit like a breakup, really, just sort of like I think I really have to draw this boundary for my own sanity. I don't feel I was lashing out. It was rather just, I felt sad that I had to leave, but I knew what I needed to do.
Had there been a thing that had happened, a conversation that had particularly upset you or depressed you? Or?
It had been an accumulation of a number of conversations. I had been involved in sort of like activist circles, progressive circles, people on the left, feminist circles for many years at that point. And I was constantly trying to have conversations about race in those spaces, and it was catastrophic a lot of the time. And then I don't think it's a coincidence that just a month and a bit before I wrote that blog post, I was invited onto a national radio show alongside 3 other women who were all white to discuss feminism. And in the course of this conversation, I was asked to define a term. In defining it, then one of the other women said, people are using this to bully me, and it just became this whole hoo-ha, and suddenly I'm being held to account for bullying. Really, you know, I think as a feminist, you have to look at all sorts of different types of inequality. And so I was one of the people in the feminist movement saying, you know, yes, sexism, I'm totally on board there. There are also other types of inequality, such as racism. And there was more than one, I think one woman on this panel felt attacked. You know, I can't say how she felt, honestly, but her response was one that appeared to imply that I'd be involved in some online bullying, and it was just, and I hadn't, it was a whole mess. And I just sort of thought, the social punishments that I sort of keep receiving repeatedly for trying to discuss race, that one being one that happened very publicly and ended up with a former member of parliament crowding. I was like, this isn't worth it.
Leaving you thinking what? That white people just don't get it?
Yeah, pretty much, you know.
And what is it that you feel they don't get?
Well, I felt that there was a willful ignorance and a real strong denial to accept that we live in a world in which racism shapes some people's opportunities in life, just like sexism does. There was a real willful ignorance, a real anger, a real denial to accept that. And I think that they thought that by accepting that, that would mean that they, as individuals, were racists. But, you know, outside of those feminist and progressive circles, I also experienced that, as well, just, with Joe Blogs on the street, or, a friend of a friend at a house party, or a housemate while I was at university. It seemed like to accept that there was still some broad racism in the world, some structural racism that affected people's life chances, was to accept that it's all their fault, which I don't believe I was ever saying. And I think in that initial blog post, that's what I articulated. You
were just pointing out that white people have a position in society that means they don't face the same kinds of discrimination that ethnic minority people do.
Yeah, and I think
It's a pretty simple thing, isn't it? I mean, why do you think people struggle to get this?
In feminist circles, it's particularly interesting to be on the receiving end of that backlash, because all the feminists get sexism, and they get that like men experience some benefits of being men, and women experience the undesirable impact of that benefit, the discrimination essentially. And I don't think that we can talk about the discrimination without talking about the people who benefit from the discrimination in all areas of inequality, which is why I talk about the fact that, as a person who isn't disabled, when I walk up steps, I'm literally benefiting from a real physical structure that is disadvantaging others, I think that's a really simple and clear way to describe it. And I know that by walking up those steps, it's not my fault, I didn't build them, but by walking up those steps and not saying, hey, this is kind of a bit unfair, I am somewhat complicit in that like broader injustice.
To what extent did you mean it though? And do you still mean it? Because in a way, this was the best way to begin a conversation with white people about race for you. And I'm sure you've had loads and loads of conversations with
many
white people about race and about the book since. Many of them will have said, oh, now I get it, now I understand, thank you very much. Did you have a sense of that when you were beginning this? Or was this a genuine cri de coeur saying, I've had enough?
When I wrote that, I meant it. I didn't have a public profile. Nobody cared about my work then. I'd been writing on the internet, blogging and stuff for years, and this was just a part of that. Writing is a way for me to process my emotions. But when I wrote that, I was A, processing emotions, and B, I really did mean it. I really, I'm a lot of things, some good, some bad, but one thing I absolutely am is self-aware, and I know when it's time to step out of the conversation, step out of the ring. I know when it's a losing game and this is not going in my favor, and that's how I felt in February 2014. I really did, particularly after that radio conversation. And so that was me saying, okay, I can't do this anymore. Here are the reasons why. And so that's what I did. I really did feel it. Now, do I feel it? Well, what's quite interesting now, it's been almost a year since the book has been out, and I think the vast majority of my readers have been so amazing, so supportive, it's incredible. The idea of the book is somewhat threatening to some people. These people are not always white, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And so I am now on the receiving end of a sort of anxiety and fear and projection that comes sometimes from people who haven't read my book. So often those people might be white, who, upon seeing the title, upon seeing the cover, need to tell me their feelings about it without reading it. And in those times, it happens fairly often, not always, but often. In those times I feel like, oh, I don't want to talk to you about this, and it's difficult, I think, particularly at events when I'm there as an author rather than just moving around my everyday life.
As a rare black author.
Well, yeah, there's very few of us black British authors.
Can we rewind a bit then? I mean, because what I really want to understand is your sense of racism and where it comes from. And whether you're talking about other people or the people you observe and study, or whether this comes from your own experience. I mean, because you were, how old are you now?
I'm 28.
You're 28, so you were 24 when you wrote this.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you feel that your life up to that point, that you had suffered racism and that you were aware of suffering racism?
Okay, that's a good question, because I think that it's both. It's both part of my understanding of racism is research. Part of it is what I feel, but I know that what I feel cannot be justified without some sort of research. So I am first and foremost a journalist. I'm interested in the big picture of things. And so, I can't say to you, oh, I suffered verbal abuse this day or verbal abuse that day. What I'm interested in is how race affects life chances. So I definitely have incidences of where, I applied for a job, then I find out that a white person with similar qualifications and experience got the job. I could tell you about that, but that's less about my like personal experience and more about the fact that that is backed up by broad data. You know, in 2009, the Department for Work and Pensions did like this actually it wasn't longitudinal. They just basically sent out 2,000 CVs, some with African sounding names, some with Asian sounding names, some with white British sounding names, and found that to be the case. So if you had an African or Asian sounding name, you were less likely to be called to interview, even though you had the same or similar qualifications and experience than a white candidate, which to me, you know, upon doing my research for the book, seemed not only like clear discrimination, but a good example of a big, like, broad structural discrimination there. And also we could see very clearly how white people, or at least people whose names were perceived to be white, were benefiting from that, which is what I mean by white privilege. And so I'm less interested in how I may have been personally dealt with. I'm interested in the ways that the world work. And I don't think it's good enough for me to say, I feel this personally, and so that's the way the world works. So like, I'm very interested in evidence.
But how you feel personally and your own experience does frame how you feel about it and how you will then write about it. And I think, you know, a lot of people who have had a public profile and have talked about this issue have done the same thing, you know, sort of not wanted to put it in their own experience. And I wonder whether that's partly because, you know, you don't want to point the finger and you don't want to be a victim, and you want it all to be objective and evidence-based, you know, and for white people who have interacted with you through your life not to feel as though you're blaming them. Whereas quite often I think people sort of then get older and kind of go, you know what, I'm sick of actually pretending that this is other people's problem and that it doesn't affect me, because it does affect me and I still feel like this. So I mean, you know, are you saying that you didn't grow up with a sense of injustice, or, you know, around yourself, or not?
I think that, well, now I know, looking back in hindsight, that if I'd gone to a private school and then gone to Oxford or Cambridge, that I probably would have, maybe getting to this point would have been a lot less of a bumpy road. But I look back on my life and I see parents, particularly a mother who, in hindsight, tried hard to buy me some middle-class privilege. And I also can think back to some of my earliest memories watching television and concluding that I have to turn white at some point because all the good people on television were white and I'm a good person. And then having that explained to me that no, that's not going to happen.
And did you grow up with ambition being drilled into you? I mean, I did. You know, I was the classic. You know, I did have all those middle class privileges bought for me, private school and lots of opportunities and lessons and learning about stuff. But I was still told, you've still got to be twice as good as the white kid if you want to do as well.
And as did I. I was definitely told, you know, be twice as good, but then also sort of sometimes push towards careers I didn't want to do. So I ended up doing what I'm doing now. So, but I think that sort of like twice as hard doctrine that I think everybody who grows up not white in the global north experiences is in such opposition to what our white friends are being taught, which is everyone's the same, treat everyone equally, equality is good, and that's something that I wanted to explore, that disparity in the book, because I think that sort of like early conceptualization of racism or unfairness, which our parents had, which is why they were telling us that when we were kids, but our white friends were not having that, is part of the reason why, you know, I then got to 24 and was facing that denial over and over again, because I was around white people who wanted the world to be a good place, which is why they were in that denial. But in doing that denial, they didn't realize they were actually making my immediate world a bad place.
Well, so when white people, when your friends or when other people you encounter say, well, I don't see race, you know, I'm colorblind, what's your response?
I mean, I think a lot of people think that about themselves, and that's nice, but the evidence shows over and over again that race shapes our life chances, you know? And I think, like, one thing I noticed a lot growing up was, you know, I grew up in the 90s, so there was a lot of, like, black, like, you don't mention someone's race if they're not white. It's like the black guy, the Asian guy. And I always wondered, like, why are we whispering there, you know? And then I sort of grew older and realized that these were terms loaded with meaning. They weren't just like straight adjectives. Whereas white wasn't something that was loaded with meaning. It could just be a straight adjective. But it was also so invisible that if somebody was white, why would you mention their race in the first place?
Well, talking about white people upsets a lot of white people.
Yes, suddenly they realize that it could also be something loaded with meaning. I think that many white people are very used to just being the default, being normal. Being the one in which others are defined against. And to be honest, isn't that like the whole European project during colonialism?
But are you saying that those people who say they are colourblind and are not in any way racist and don't notice people's colour are not telling the truth about how they really judge things and make decisions, or are not aware of their own prejudices, or are just the minority?
Well, I can't speak for them, but so I don't know whether or not they're straight up lying. I think that, you know, nobody wants to define themselves with characteristics that they find undesirable, right? So that's probably why people call themselves colorblind. I don't think that noticing race makes you racist. I think that assigning negative value to races that are not white makes you racist, which, you know, sometimes that stuff isn't teased out for people until they undergo a number of psychological personality tests. But it isn't just something that is like within the soul of a human being, and that if that a person has that prejudice or that bias, that makes them a bad person. More broadly, it's something that we keep seeing repeated over and over again in like our cultural institutions, like, you know, our media and our politics, and, you know, who gets to be seen as human. And I now know that, looking back to 4-year-old me watching television being like, when am I going to turn white because I'm a good person, I'd already absorbed that. It's a very, very pernicious narrative, I think.
And is there any reason why you use words like structural or institutional in front of racism rather than just saying racism?
Well, I really want people to think about the big picture, so that's why I use structural and institutional. I've also sometimes been asked, why do you use structural rather than institutional? And I'm like, oh, well, really the reason was that, you know, sometimes I think with the word institutional, we can just think of like our more formal institutions like the NHS or, you know, a particular workplace. And I really wanted people to see how these racial hierarchies and biases were repeating really close to home, not just in more formal institutions. And sometimes I regret that because I don't know if it's causing confusion or not.
How do you feel the book and the arguments have been received?
Well, I feel they've been received well. Based on the feedback that I'm seeing. You may be seeing other feedback, but I think that people are... I think what the book seems to be doing is equipping people with language that for things that they wanted to express but didn't know how to.
Black people, mostly.
Not always. I think like people of all races have reached out. People who felt that there was some injustice have reached out to say that. There's a split in my readership in terms of people who are white and people who are not. People who are white tend to go, wow, my mind has changed. People who are not white say, thank you for articulating something that I've been trying to for some time and not succeeding because it just feels so fraught. What
do you feel the trajectory is, though? I mean, one of the chapters in your book is Fear of a Black Planet, taken from a famous record. And, you know, Fear of a Black Planet is a sort of a strange construct, isn't it? Because even if you have a black planet, it'll probably still be run by white people, according to the way society is set up. So what do you feel our trajectory is in terms of making progress?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think that this Fear of a Black Planet is creating a whole lot of fear at the moment in terms of like the demographics of the global north, America, the UK, Europe. And there's this sort of feeling, I think, amongst the far right. I think the far right are really banging this drum, but the things that they are saying is seeping into the public consciousness. So like this whole sort of concept that that our demographics are changing in such a way that white people are no longer going to be the majority in their own countries, I'm quoting this, is what I would call a fear of a black planet. And I think that it can be quite potent. It can be a potent form of argument that comes from the far right. My counter is always, particularly, in Britain, and Britain being part of Europe, countries that really did try and expand and take over the world with their empires. We have to sort of reckon with what that has meant for all of these other countries around the world and what it means for Britain's sense of identity, full stop. Which, even though those empires instilled a sense of white superiority, the reality is that just Britain's reach has touched so many countries around the world that the future of Britain is never going to be pure white. It just won't.
But do you think fear of a black planet is just a far right thing? I mean, it strikes me as quite a mainstream thing.
Well, yeah, that's why I said I believe it started to seep into the public consciousness. Absolutely.
And do you think, the funny thing about the fear of, the notion that black people are going to take over the world is always, it's far more confident than how black people feel themselves on the whole. I don't know any black people who think we're going to be ruling the world.
No.
It's only ever white people who think of that as a possible future, which just suggests it's kind of nonsense.
It certainly is fueled by a lot of paranoia, and I just think you need to look at Parliament, and not only Parliament, but also where the vast majority of our MPs are coming from, to know that that's sewn up for another few hundred years. There's really no worry about that. While you were saying that, you were reminding me of that film Black Panther, and how one of the characters tried to take over the world to no avail.
I mean, do you think that there is anything going on at the moment that makes this a black moment or a good time to be black?
I think that it's an exciting moment for people who, haven't gone to the cinema and seen everyone the same race as them. But more importantly, I think it's a very interesting and exciting moment for anti-racism as a whole. I mean, I'm obviously a black British person, but what I'm really interested in is anti-racism, which I think we all know that you don't have to be, not every black person is interested in anti-racism. Those who are not make themselves very known, right? So I'm not going to ever say it's a prerequisite. Although it's fair to say that anti-racism is black politics, right? Black with a capital B. I'm going on now. But so I think it's an exciting moment for people who are interested in the politics of anti-racism, because we are seeing some of those representation issues that we've been talking about for some time coming to the fore, some solutions coming to the fore. But I think the fact that they are still so exceptional, those solutions, those changes,
what sort of
speaks to the problem. Oh, like the Black Panther film, or, things in film and music. Look, I'm not a culture vulture, so I can't tell you exactly which bit of pop culture is great. All I know is that I'm often asked to speak on them, and I'm like, I don't know. I do not watch music videos. I have no idea. And also I think that there's been somewhat of a cultural straitjacket on representations of blackness that is finally being loosened. So you can see black creatives be a little bit more adventurous or alternative in their self-expression, which is also really exciting. So yeah, I think I think that I could have definitely done with this moment while I was being a teenager, when I was growing up.
Why? What was it like growing up?
Well,
what do you feel was missing?
When I was growing up, I had a lot of interests, some that were not always stereotypically black, and I was told sometimes categorically, this isn't for black people.
Like what?
Oh, for example, this is going to sound so embarrassing, right? But emo music. I was really into emo music, and there was no black emos. Or sort of being told, this is the music that you should like, this is the way that you should dress, etc., etc. These are the films that you should like. And I think it's exciting to see that those straitjackets are being loosened, and that people can. I can't believe I just admitted to liking emo music. My cred is down the drain.
Are those days gone?
They're gone. My cred is down the drain.
Did you lack confidence then as a teenager in being black?
I think like I felt weighed down by the weight of meaning that blackness had, that I then had to navigate as a 16, 17-year-old. That was difficult.
To conform to stereotype.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was difficult. And I'm seeing, young black people, some who come to my book signings, it's just seeming a lot more free and a lot more sort of self-accepting and excited about things. Seeing a black woman with natural hair back then would have been just totally, wouldn't have happened. So it's exciting for me, even though I didn't really expect it, being a writer, being somebody who's usually behind a laptop, to suddenly be thrust into the public eye with my hair that just grows naturally out of my head, and then have people come up to me and say, oh, I saw you here, there, everywhere, and your hair, and I'm like, it's quite normal to me, but knowing that for somebody that's been an affirmation is really exciting.
And also, what do you mean, when you talk about black, we should just say, what do you mean by black?
Okay, so really I'm talking about people with African or Caribbean ancestry is what I'm talking about. I'm not using it in the political sense, which is usually it's referred to describe people who are not white, basically, yeah. And it's a kind of like solidarity unifying phrase. I'm not using it in that way. Even though I don't disagree with that use, I just think as a writer who wishes to be understood, I'm going to use the word in a way more accurate. Yeah, I want to use the words in a way that everybody can immediately understand, but I have to go and search the word or in the thesaurus.
Because it does. I mean, when you look at the facts, if you like, you do need to sort of break down races, don't you? If you want to talk about black boys, you should also look at, Bangladeshi boys and girls versus Indian boys and girls, and all of those, and they all have different outcomes at school and often in life chances. So, I mean, to what extent do you think different ethnic minorities have the same experience of racism in Britain?
It's quite interesting you refer to those stats, actually, because I think that they are very useful in looking at inequality in life chances. I wouldn't say it's all the same. But at the same time, I'm not really interested in unifying that experience. Rather, I'm interested in examining what whiteness means for power, particularly in this country. That's what I'm most interested in, rather than examining the difference between, black Caribbean boys and Bangladeshi boys. I think it's useful for my analysis, first and foremost. But that's really where.
But do you think there are groups that white people are more and less racist about?
I don't know. I have not investigated that. There always feels like there's a new public enemy number one in the public consciousness, So, for example, something like Islamophobia, which I have never been party to, feels like a state of public emergency at the moment, particularly with this whole horrible, what is it, like Punish a Muslim Day or something, that's that a lot of people are concerned about in this country. And, I recognise that I think...
There's always somebody who's bottom of the pile.
Yeah, there's British Muslims who are being really they're at the forefront of covert anger, discrimination and prejudice at this moment, in the same way that I think I, as a black British person, I am not party to.
Where does articulating this argument take you then in terms of thinking about answers, about making the world a better place, changing the world, which is the framing for our programme? I mean, to what extent have you found yourself coming up with ideas for answers? Okay,
so the reason I wrote the book really was to change hearts and minds. I really wanted to change people's minds on this issue, and I felt all I need to sort of do. This is a naive and utopian sort of ideal. In a review, somebody compared my work to James Baldwin's in this particular instance of James Baldwin just thought all he needed to do, the only reason this was happening was because of ignorance, and if only people knew. And I was absolutely coming from that tradition as well, which was, let me just change people's minds on this one. Just allow me to put out a piece of work in which you cannot argue back with me because it's written down, and let me know what you think afterwards. So I really do feel like Hearts and Minds being changed is such an instrumental way to change the world. I know that I personally don't like feeling imposed upon. I never have. And I think that there was an element to which sometimes, like, putting forward ideas for a better society makes some feel imposed upon. And I'm not convinced that we can always, like, brush it off as, oh, those people are just bigots. I actually want those people to be like, okay, well, what's this person actually coming from? You know, I want to convince them. As much as I want to put voice to concerns that people like me with similar beliefs as me have always felt, right? So that's really where I'm coming from.
But if the discrimination is often not conscious or deliberate, you need to give people mechanisms to fight the inbuilt structural or institutional racism that you're identifying, don't you? And, you know, the number of conversations I've had with, you know, with senior people in all sorts of industries who can't begin to imagine themselves as racist, but can see that there is, you know, evidentially a problem in their own industry in terms of the people who are being promoted and the people who are getting the top jobs and all those sorts of things. And they just don't know what to do about it. So we need to give them some ideas.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I would say to you is definitely give those people a copy of my book. Hopefully it would allow them to interrogate themselves in a way that it's never occurred to them before. And then, like, some of the things that I say towards the end of the book, one of the things I say is that I'm not here to be prescriptive and tell you individually what to do, because A, I'm not a consultant, and I'm not really into 10-point plans. Like, I really want people to feel I hate this word empowered, but I have to use it. I want people to feel like they can bring something to the table. I feel part of a movement, and I feel like people who read my work and, you know, really take to it are also part of that movement. So I don't want to provide people with the answers. I want to provide people with a single tool that can allow them to make the case for what they are trying to change initially. I think one thing that I would always say to readers is, this is going to sound so hypocritical based on that initial blog post, but if you can meet people where they're at, to some extent, do. If you find that is something that is eroding your sanity, then don't do it. You know, I think that you should sort of reserve the right to step away from the conversation if need be, because, well, there's loads of us in the world, actually. So it's not just you. It's never just you, and the baton can always be passed on. I think looking after yourself. And when I look back to that initial blog post, I think about it in its, like, most focused terms, which was not just a comment on, like, the broad sense of the world, like the world as it is now, but also just about human relationships and power and empathy and sympathy. And what I was sort of saying in that initial post was, I'm not getting any, I'm in a situation where there's an extreme power differential here in terms of whose story is believed. And not only that, but I am not on the receiving end of any benefit of the doubt, empathy, sympathy. And there was a time when I wrote that initial post when I started to really think that these white people I was dealing with lacked empathy, you know, and it was a scary time, right? I think one of the things that the book's taught me is that that's not the case, which is good, because I don't want to be living in a world where that is the case. But
why? I mean, what's changed? Why have you learned that
I've written this book
white
and
people
loads
have got empathy that you didn't think existed?
Well, I've written this book and a ton of white people have come to me and said, I hear you on this, and I'm going to do my part. So that's a key moment there, you know, and I'm glad that I've created something that can sort of speak for me on that.
So what do you think of some of the ideas that get thrown around then in terms of removing structural, or the effects of structural racism? So, you know, the big one is the difference between, you know, positive action to try and encourage black people and ethnic minorities into certain roles and certain jobs, and having quotas or positive discrimination.
I mean, I don't disagree with positive action. I'm here because of it. You know, I benefited from positive action, like journalism scheme when I was right at the beginning of my career. And so I'm I'm not against it, evidently not. I also recognise that we have to continue to make the case as to why the idea of meritocracy does not exist yet. And those people who say...
Just explain why.
Well, if you look around your office and everyone's white, is it really meritocracy? Does it just happen to be the case that everyone who was perfectly suited for that job is white? Because if over and over again we keep looking at our senior leadership and those people, the vast majority of them are white, then what you're saying is that, well, everyone who isn't white, they're just not talented enough. And it's not just a case that you look around your office and it's not an isolated incident either. It's basically almost all powerful offices where this is the case. So it can't, if you're saying it's about meritocracy in that context, you are saying that people who are not white are not talented enough.
I'm saying that the thing that often frightens people, not just white people, but black and other ethnic minority people too, is the idea of changing the law to allow employers to specifically hire people from one particular group or another. And they say this would be terrible and this would lead to terribly divisive offices or newsrooms, and people wouldn't trust that the person that they're working for was really better, was really up to the job and all of those things. And do you worry about any of those things, or do you think there is an argument for redressing decades or hundreds of years of structural imbalance by saying we need to imbalance it the other way?
Is there something on the cards to change the law? Because I haven't heard about this.
No, there isn't.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering whether you think there should be.
I don't know about changing the law. Again, other anti-racist campaigners would argue with me on this one, but I personally am all about changing hearts and minds rather than the law. I kind of think when the law is changed without the hearts and minds being won, then you get a whole lot of resentment, personally. That's what I think. So, but the case has to be made to get people understanding that actually informally people have been already choosing from very narrow pools of who they believe is the best for the job. That's been happening informally, and we can see the evidence in senior leadership teams of extremely powerful institutions repeatedly. I don't believe that only middle-aged white men are the most talented in society. But if I looked around at people who are in positions of power, that would be the conclusion that I would draw. But I don't believe it.
Now, how long are you prepared to wait?
That's why I'm in favour of quotas.
Because you are in favour of quotas?
Yeah, I don't want to wait.
Okay.
I don't want to wait another 200 years for things to happen naturally. Because
so
what's been happening before isn't natural, actually.
So what does quotas mean to you? I mean, how would it work?
Well, I quite like the idea of the Rooney Rule, which is now you've got me doing policy proposals.
We're talking about ways to change the world.
Okay, fine. Well, the Rooney Rule that I sort of refer to in the book, which I believe it started in American football.
Yeah, which is where you have to have one non-white person in your interview list.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're employing any job, any senior job.
Who is equally as talented and with similar skills and experience as all the other people on your interview list.
But that's not quotas.
No, that isn't actually. That's not a quota. No, I think the Rooney Rule is quite tame.
So you would go for quotas? You just said you would. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, would I go for quotas? I also kind of think that it's a situation where the talent needs to be found in the first place in order to fill the quota. And if you're not putting any effort into finding the talent, but you're looking to just fill the quota, then
are you
you're not
afraid
doing
of the
job.
backlash if you say, yes, I want quotas?
Not really. I don't know. I don't really think about these things. Go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been going to seminars and meetings and discussions about this for 30 years, and that is the point at which you always hit that. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I suppose I think high percentage outcomes are good things to work towards. I don't doubt that. But unless you have the culture change, then the ways in which people reach the high percentage outcome may be somewhat nefarious, is what I think. And then when these things are nefarious and things go wrong, they'd be like, oh well, it's the quota's fault. So again, I really want to change hearts and minds here. So I'm 100% undecided, but you know,
I've just watched that indecision.
I haven't thought about this since I wrote the book. So,
well, no, I mean, I think it's a really difficult one, and people often, end up in that same circle of, is it better to change people's hearts and minds and get them to do it naturally, or is it better to force them to do it because they're not doing it? And the longer you wait for natural change to happen, the more impatient you become. I mean, what I wonder is whether you've actually become more patient since enjoying the success of the book than you were when you wrote this blog post.
I'm an impatient person. I'm definitely an impatient person. The one thing that's changed since I wrote that initial blog post is my personal circumstances. Okay, I am experiencing an odd sort of experience of being the eye of a storm that's happening, but I also hear from people on a regular basis who have been pushing for things like quotas in their workplaces and feel like they're smashing their heads against a brick wall. And then they tell me that they've bought my book and they're giving it to their boss. So, which I think is incredible and amazing, and I just hope that nobody's penalised for that.
And to what extent do you think, youth is the answer? Because again, I think for as long as I can remember, I've been hearing people say, well, young people aren't racist. Young people are colourblind. They don't see any differences, and that there will be a natural shift away from structural racism or institutional racism or any kind of racism as these generations take over, and there are more mixed race children and more mixed classrooms and all those sorts of things. I have to say it's taking an awful long time.
Yeah, because young people get old. So, also, has there been that recent spate of reportings around, racial abuse and harassment at universities? And you can't get much younger than that, right? So, and I say reporting rather than recent spate of, because I'm pretty sure this stuff's been happening for a long time, but now it's newsworthy. So I actually, I've written, you can find me on record, a byline saying the young people are our future, the teenagers are going to save us all. But I actually now think that that's a way of deferring responsibility for those of us who are older. It is. It's a bit like, oh, well, I don't need to get too bogged down about this. I've got bills to pay and other priorities. The youth with a little bit more time on their hands will sort this out for us. And I don't believe that anymore. I think it's fantastic. It's great that young people are becoming more politicized, but that doesn't evade me of my responsibility, or you or anybody else, to make the world a better place.
And so do you think young people are still learning to be racist?
And I think that what's happening with the youngsters is sort of indulgence in retro racism, doing things for shock value, to get attentions. And
what do you mean by that? Okay.
I'm thinking about these like recent spate of like university-based harassment and racial abuse. One in which a young black girl was sort of trapped in her room hearing men outside, young men, 19, 20, shout racial abuse. And it sounded like they were about to head out for a night out or something and were perhaps a bit drunk. And I think there is a big concern, I think particularly for young white men, because we are now living in a society where there's a pushback against racism and a somewhat broad acceptance for anti-racism, at least in my world, in my echo chamber. It seems that to actually be racist is now edgy. It's controversial. It will get you kudos. And that's a matter of concern for me, because that is evidence that the youth are not the answer, basically.
Albeit that there'll be a pretty small subset, those particular people, weren't they, of young people. So, I mean, to what extent are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Well, I'm very optimistic, because I'm the person who wrote this book and it's going well.
And because of the reaction you've had towards it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm certainly not pessimistic. I feel quite shocked, really. I think shocked at the amount of people for whom they have the same they feel an urgency about the topic. They feel an urgency, and
Why does that shock you?
because I think for such a long time I thought, well, this is solipsistic, isn't it? I thought I was the only person feeling that urgency. I felt like everywhere I turned to try and discuss it, I was faced with brick walls, not necessarily from white people, sometimes even from older black people who were like, oh, we've already done this. We were talking about this 30 years ago. And I'm like, well, I wasn't born then, so can you cut me some slack here? Yeah, I felt like I was the only person feeling the urgency. And what felt like a sort of like white hot rage at the state of affairs. And I think it must be a testament to the book that other people are feeling that urgency. What we want, of course, is for that white hot rage to be channeled into something exciting and constructive. What that might be,
And how can that be?
I can't say.
Because you were a student politician and you've been involved in the left and all that kind of at that time. I mean, how do you view the current left? You know, the Corbyn Labour Party. Is that a conduit to change the world when it comes to racism?
Well, I can tell you I'm not involved in the Corbyn Labour Party. There's, from the outside, it certainly seems like there is some concern about these issues, which is better than the situation has been in politics for the last 10 years. So, but politicians, man, I mean, I'm just a bit like, these guys drop their priorities for an election any day. So being a student politician put me off. Like, I was like, this is not the forum for me. I'm all about independent thought. Party politics, to a lesser or greater extent, is all about following lines. I'm just too unruly to be in that space. So yeah, I'll pay attention. Of course, I'll always pay attention, but it's not for me. So, but I'll watch with bemusement.
One of the questions I'm asking all my guests is what they think their most controversial opinion is.
I think not talking to white people about race. That's a real controversial opinion. Even though since the book came out, even in the acquisition of the book, I mean, I'm working with a publishing house full of white people. Like, it's something I've had to continue to do. So I always get people going, are you really not? To which I say, well, I did write 80,000 words on this topic. And I always go back to the original blog post that I wrote, and I was deadly serious at that time. And yes, I think it's fair. You picked up that my position has somewhat softened over the years. But when I am out, it's always when I'm at the forefront of some ignorance, anger, or denial that I am right back in that place. And I am like, yeah, I can't do this today.
Reni Eddo Lodge, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
That's great.